Yo, what is going on, guys? Series here. In today's video, we're going to be starting the fourth part of the GSC scripting series on my channel. If you haven't seen the previous 3 videos, go ahead and check them out because they're going to have some code that you're going to need for today. One thing I want to mention, you're going to notice that I no longer have the utility.gsc right here. You can go ahead and delete that from your project. It's not really necessary. It just kind of inflates the project capacity, and it's really only useful for developers who are jumping into a project where they would need specific functions, which we don't need. So we're just going to get rid of them. You are still going to need my utility if you don't have this Serious GSC, or if you don't have what's in this Serious GSC. Go ahead and download it from the description below. It's on GitHub. Just make sure every time you watch a video that you have the most updated version. So let's go ahead and get into what we're going to do today. The goal of today is to be able to open and close our menu base. If you noticed from the title of this video, this is going to be the first video in a sub-series of the scripting tutorials where we actually create a menu base from scratch. This is something I've had requested to me for years by multiple people, and I just want to go ahead and finally get around to it because I think this is the perfect place to put it. So all we're going to do today is a very simple iPrint line and a couple of functions that are going to manage our access to this base. I'm going to make sure to explain some of the stuff that I haven't explained yet as far as the GSC scripting language goes, and hopefully you'll be able to pick up some new information from this video. Let's go ahead and get rid of our God mode toggle and infinite ammo toggle calls today. We're not going to need them anymore. You can leave the functions here. I would recommend leaving them here because we might use them later in the series, but for now, just get rid of the calls to them. So let's go ahead and add our first function that we're going to add today, which is set access. Now normally we would just add our 2 parentheses and add our open and close brackets and be done. But we actually need something called a parameter today. Now we're just going to put access in here, and if you are familiar at all with programming, you're going to know what a parameter is, or you might be able to pick it up from how we've been calling functions recently. But just think of this as giving a variable to a function to use. So like what we're going to do here is self set access true. Okay, so if you think about this logically, we're calling the set access function, and we're passing the true argument to this function. So what that's going to do is basically just set access to true while it's running this set of code. Because if you remember, a function is just a set of commands. So what we'll do is we'll self notify access. If you remember from the last video, a notification is just sending a message to whoever called it. In this instance, the caller is going to be the player who spawned, because you see we call self set access, and then we say self notify access. Then we're going to set our access variable to be equal to the access variable that we pass to this. So if we call this function, we see set access true, which means self.access is actually going to be equal to true when we pass it as true. We're going to say self.submenu equals none. This is going to be a variable we use later to determine what menu we're in. None will just be we're not in a menu, or the menu's closed. Then we're going to do if bool self.access. We're going to go outside of the parentheses, and we're going to put some brackets. And we're going to type self thread menu base. Now, this function doesn't exist right now, so we're going to add that in. Menu base. Add our open and close parentheses. We don't need any parameters this time. And add our open and close brackets. And let's go ahead and add a end on, self, end on, access, self, end on, disconnect. If you remember from the last video, an end on will end the current function whenever it receives this message. So for example, when we set access, we get notified access, which means if this function is running, it's going to quit. And the reason we want that to happen is because whenever we set access, we want, if the player has this menu base function running, for it to stop, because we don't want them to have their menu base after we change the access. So what we'll go ahead and do is now add a while loop, while bool self.access, meaning while we have access to the menu. And then we are going to add a wait 0.025. So this is going to run this while we have access to the menu. And we are going to do if self.submenu is equal to none. And then we're going to add an open and close bracket. Let's go ahead and add a comment right here. If the menu is closed, because that way if we ever come back to this function, which we will multiple times, we'll know that everything inside of this is only going to happen if the menu base is closed. We're going to add something called a continue at the bottom of here, and all a continue does is jump back to the top of the while loop. It skips all the code below it. So like even if I have self iPrintline, whatever, right? It doesn't matter. Any of the code down here gets skipped because of the continue. So the reason we're using this is just because basically we're going to write some code down here for when the menu is actually open. And if we execute code while the menu is closed, we don't want it to continue down to that code. Okay, so we're going to add an if statement, not, and go ahead and add some parentheses because we're going to write a expression here. Self is button pressed, and I'm going to use SL buttons melee, and I'm going to add a space here. Make sure that you have 2 parentheses on the side when you press space because it matters. We're going to do and. Now, these 2 ampersand signs, first of all, if you don't know where the ampersand is on the keyboard, it is going to be Shift 7, and you need 2 of them. And the reason is because this is basically saying if this is true and whatever comes after it is also true, right? So it's basically how we combine it to where we don't have to write multiple if statements. So self is button pressed, SL buttons ADS. So you'll see that this combined now says if we don't have the melee button and action or ADS button pressed, then we're going to do whatever's inside of this loop. We're going to continue. Now, if you remember, normally we have to have brackets on our if statements. Well, if you only have one command, like you don't have more than one command that you need to happen in the if statement, you actually don't need to use brackets. I would say it's generally bad practice to not include brackets in your if statements because it makes the code hard to read. But if you use it sparingly, it can be all right for the most part. I've avoided it generally in this series, but if you remember in our God mode toggle, we had a while loop with no brackets and things like that. So you should be getting used to that syntax by now. I just wanted to clarify that because I did start the series by telling you always need the open and close bracket. You can't declare a function without brackets, and there is no exception to that. So just keep that in mind. And also remember that anytime you have more than one command to run, you do need your brackets. So we're going to call set menu open true. Okay, and that's going to be a function we write in a minute, but we don't need it right now. We're going to do while self is button pressed, SL underscore buttons underscore melee, or this is going to be right above your enter key. You're going to press shift and then press that backslash, and you should get this symbol. Whenever you see this symbol, just remember it means or. So you know how you have up here, you have and, where it checks if this is true and this is true. Well, here, this is going to be if this is true or whatever is on the right side is true. Hopefully that's pretty self-explanatory. If it's not, just ask me in the comments below and I can hopefully give a better explanation to it. Self is button pressed, SL underscore buttons underscore ADS. wait 0.025. So let's really quickly go over this logic because we did a lot. All this is doing is checking if we don't have the melee and ADS button pressed at the same time, and just telling it basically if that happens to just skip the rest of the code. We don't care about it because we don't have our melee and ADS button pressed, which is going to be our open buttons for the menu. However, if we do have them pressed at the same time, we're going to go ahead and set the menu to be open. And then while those buttons are pressed, while one of them is pressed, we're going to wait because if we don't wait, we'll get that spammy toggle that always happens whenever you don't wait at the bottom of your check. Let's go ahead and do our set menu open really quickly. So set menu open, and then we're going to add a parameter is open, and then we're going to add our brackets, and we're going to say if bool is open, self.menu, I'm sorry, submenu equals main, else self.submenu equals none. Okay, and then we're going to do a self iPrintLine bold right here because this iPrintLine is going to tell us what our current submenu is, and this is going to be for debugging. All right, so let's go ahead and test. Let me make sure this is not going to freeze us. It looks fine. Let's check our syntax. Our syntax looks fine. Let's go ahead and inject it to the target. Hopefully we don't get any warnings or errors, and hopefully I don't freeze. That would really suck. All that should happen is we should be able to open the menu right now. As you can see, my legacy PC is finally starting to take its time loading. All right, and we're good. And we're going to spawn in, and I'm going to press my melee button, nothing happens. I'm going to ADS, nothing happens. And if I do them at the same time, I get main to pop up. And there's nothing else we can really do from here because we haven't told it how to close the menu. So let's go ahead and add a bind to close the menu. Under our original if statement, where it's closed, we want to say if self is button pressed, SL buttons melee. And we're going to add this down here. We're going to go ahead and add a continue at the bottom of this because we don't want it to go past this if this button is pressed. And we're going to say while self is button pressed, SL underscore buttons underscore melee, wait 0.025 so we don't get that spammy toggle. And we're going to say if self.submenu is equal to main set, or we'll do self set menu open false. And we're going to actually change this to do self as well. You don't have to, basically, if you're not changing the caller, you don't have to call it. But to make our code more readable, we're going to go ahead and always call set menu open with self, just to be sure. And what this will do is, if we press the melee button and our current menu is main, then we're going to close the menu by setting open menu to false. And if we go ahead and check our syntax and inject, compile server is kind of slow today. Or it might just be my PC because I have a lot of stuff running in the background. We go ahead and aim and melee, we get main. And then if we melee again, we get none. And there you go. It tells you whether the menu is open or closed. Now really quickly, for the last few minutes of this video, we're going to go ahead and review some of the stuff we've done because I did kind of go over stuff really quickly. So if we check our code from when we spawn in, if we're the host, we set our access to true. If we look at our set access, you see that the access parameter is going to get stored in our access variable on the player. It's basically saying the player's access is equal to whatever is passed to this function. So in this example, we have access, or basically our access is enabled. Then we say our current submenu is none. That's just the default submenu, meaning the menu is closed. And then we say if we have access, thread the menu base function. If you remember, threading just means that it's going to run at the same time as everything else, and that the function is not going to wait for this to finish. Then we're going to say basically if we get disconnected or our access changes, to just go ahead and end the function because we don't want to do anything from there. And while we have access, we're going to wait for a split second just to make sure that the game doesn't freeze if we don't wait. And then we're going to check our current submenu. If it's equal to none, aka the menu's closed, and we don't have the buttons to open pressed, we're not going to do anything. If we do have the buttons pressed, however, we're going to open the menu by calling this function here, which is just going to change the submenu, and I print whatever the submenu is equal to. Then we're going to wait while either of those buttons is pressed, just because we don't want it to spam toggle. And then we are going to skip the rest of the code if all this went successfully. Then we're going to say if basically the menu is open and this doesn't actually happen, then we're going to check if we have a melee button pressed. And if we are currently in the main menu and we have our melee button pressed, which is the back button for the menu, we're going to close the menu by setting it to not be open, because it would not make sense for us to go back when we don't have anywhere to go back to. Then we're going to wait so we don't spam toggle and skip the rest of the code below this. Now there is no code below this right now, but when we continue to work on the base, there will be. Hopefully this made sense. I know I'm going kind of fast now. There's a lot of content to cover working on a menu base. If you didn't understand anything, let me know and I'll try to cover it in the next video, or I'll talk about it in the comment section. Hopefully this was helpful to you, and hopefully this is going to help you get on the right track to start working on a menu base. I will continue this menu base for quite a few videos. I don't know how many it's going to be. It's just going to basically go as long as it needs to go until we can actually make a menu base, a full menu base. And that's it. Hopefully you guys enjoyed. See you in the next video. Peace.